I'm Karen Heitch. I'm an occupational therapist. I'm the owner of the Heitch Center for Sensory and Motor Learning in Jasper and Dora, Alabama. Today we're going to talk about sensory processing disorder. Specifically, we're going to identify our sensory systems and identify modulation and discrimination. So let's start. What is sensory processing disorder? First, we need to understand that it is not a recognizable medical diagnosis. So you can't use it in an IFSP, IEP, or 504. It's simply not recognized by our medical community at this time. Now, the term sensory processing disorder, or I'm going to talk about sensory processing deficits, is different than the term sensory integration. Sensory integration is something all of our bodies do. It's the process of taking in and processing input from our environment. Now, once we process that information, we should be able to respond appropriately. So, when there's deficits or sensory processing deficits, the ability to process and utilize that information appropriately doesn't work correctly. Now, often we talk about autism and sensory processing deficits or disorders as if it's all one thing. Autism is a diagnosis that often encompasses sensory processing deficits. Now, children can have deficits, sensory processing deficits, without having autism. For children with sensory processing deficits, we tend to see a lot of anxiety. We often see learning disabilities as well as food intolerances. There's more than just our typical 5 sensory systems, and we're going to talk about each one of those and how it affects the different areas. So first is our tactile system. This is our sense of touch, and the receptors are located in our skin. There's 2 different types of touch. There's deep touch, which is more of a kind of a press or a squeeze, and there's light touch, which is more of somebody brushing up against you. That's important because some children may like one type and not the other. So it may look like, oh, they really don't like touch, but they may not like the light touch. They may like deep touch. So you start really watching your child and seeing if there's one that they like or dislike more than the other. Now, our tactile system gives us information required for everyday activities. Think about language. How do you know what squishy is? How do you know what rough or soft is? It's because we touch it. We use our tactile system to help us understand that language. You can't learn that without experimenting, without exploring through our tactile system. If you've had a bad day, what makes you feel better? Typically a hug. So that if you don't like touch, you may not have that good sense of safety and security. So we see as children age, especially those children who may have had trauma, who have a lot of emotional security issues, they may be tactily defensive. Proprioception. The receptors are located deep in our joints and muscles, and it allows us to know what our bodies are doing. So we know we're moving forward or backwards without looking at our feet. Now, our proprioceptive system also helps us with social emotional development. It allows us to know how far or how close to stand to somebody. It also helps us with daily living skills. We know where our body is in space, so we can lift up one foot to get dressed. Our vestibular system, the receptors are located in our inner ear, and it allows us to maintain our balance and move through space without falling. Now, when there's dysfunction in the vestibular system, we see significant amounts of anxiety. As I mentioned, we see anxiety with all sensory deficits, but especially with vestibular. If you're sitting in a chair and somebody comes and pulls it back, it increases your anxiety. You get in a fight or flight state. So for many of our children, that's what it's like for them every single day. They're constantly worried and scared. It feels like, again, somebody's constantly pulling you back. So when you're always in that fight or flight mode, you see other behaviors such as teeth grinding, chin tapping, hand flapping, different anxiety type behaviors. Our vestibular system is also connected to our muscle tone, so it allows us to sit up straight. And when you have low muscle tone, you have poor posture. You also have drooling because those muscles around your mouth they have poor muscle tone. Our vestibular system is also connected to our visual system. Any head movement, turning your head left, right, looking up or down, activates your vestibular system. So when you're reading, especially when you're copying from the board, it's important for those two systems to be well integrated. If they're not, a child's going to lose their place consistently. It's going to be very, very hard for them to engage in those activities. Our visual system, the receptors are located in our eyes, and it allows us to see. Our auditory system is our sense of hearing. It is also connected to our vestibular system simply because the receptors are located in our ear as well. Our olfactory system is our sense of smell, and our gustatory system is our sense of taste. And then lastly is our interoceptive system. This is the inner workings of our body. It allows us to know how fast our heart is beating. It allows us to know if we're hungry or thirsty and when we need to use the restroom. There are 3 different types of sensory processing disorders or deficits: modulation, discrimination, and sensory-based motor. Today, I think we're only going to have time to talk about the first 2, modulation and discrimination. So the 3 types of modulation is over, under, and seeking. And each one of these has very specific characteristics. And we're going to talk about those. But first, I want to say that most children, actually in 25 years, I've never seen a single child who is just over responsive in all sensory areas. So this is just an example what you see on your screen. Craving is seeking. Hyper is more or over, and then hypo is under responsive. So for this example, this child is seeking or craving tactile and proprioceptive input. They're over responsive to auditory input and under responsive to visual input, and all the other areas are typical. So when we talk about these deficits, it's important to identify the different type as well as the specific sensory system. So for children who are under responsive, this means they're not getting enough input for it to register appropriately. So what happens is they're often seen as just lazy because they just don't get up and go. They may not respond to injuries, and they may be left out. For children who are auditorily under responsive, they may not respond to their name being called, and they may speak loudly. Olfactory, these children may not smell or respond to even strong smells, which is certainly a safety issue. Our under-responsive to tactile input is also a safety concern. These children often don't respond to injuries. We've had children who have stood in fire ant beds and not responded. Simply, they just didn't feel it. But because they need more input, they may constantly touch other things or people. These are also our kids who always seem to be messy because they're not aware that their face is dirty, so they don't wipe it. Under responsive to visual input, these are our kids who like to stare at ceiling fans or line up toys. For under responsive to vestibular input, when we start falling, we have a reflex called protective reflexes. So when our body realizes we're falling, we put our hands out to catch ourselves. The problem with children who are under responsive to vestibular, they don't realize they're falling because they're not getting that input. So when they fall, they tend to fall very, very hard. If a child is under responsive to proprioceptive input, these are our kids who tackle instead of hug. They tend to break things when they hold them just because they hold them so very tight. They also may enjoy wearing tight clothing or being under heavy objects. And then lastly is interception. These children may not feel hunger or thirst, so they may go all day without eating. Those hunger pains may have to be fairly intense before they realize they need to eat. These are also our kids who are the hardest to potty train because they don't feel the need to use the restroom until that urgency is immediate. Now, our seekers, these are our kids who tend to be identified as ADHD. They tend to not like school because they have to sit still. For auditory seekers, these are kids who love loud noise. They turn the radio up or they talk really loud. They also don't like silence, so they will find a way to make noise. They may click or hum or tap or just excessively talk. For olfactory, these kids constantly smell things. Our tactile seekers are our kids who are constantly touching. They run their hands along the wall. They tend to like to play. They tend to like messy play. Visual seekers, these are our kids who stare at objects and like bright lights. Our rockers and our spinners are our vestibular seekers, and our crashers are our sensory seekers as well. And then lastly is our interception. These kids often take large, deep breaths, almost like they're exhausted, but it feels good to them. Hunger and thirst pains may feel good, so they may just not eat or drink. And then those may withhold bowel and bladder because that sensation feels good to them. Now, the last type of modulation is defensiveness or over responsiveness. These children tend to be seen as some behavior concerns. They may get upset when encouraged to participate or even seen as a bully because they push kids away. So, for our over responsiveness to auditory input, these are kids who may ask others to be quiet. They may cover their ears and startle very easily. Olfactory over responsiveness. If a child doesn't like a certain place or certain person, you might want to think about the odor. A lot of people wear a lot of perfume or burn candles. For many kids, that is a very offensive smell to them, and they just don't want to be around it. For our tactile over responsiveness, these are our kids who don't like their socks turned, tags in their clothes, brushing their teeth, brushing their hair. All of these things is very, very hard for them. Visual over responsiveness, bright lights and bright colors can be overwhelming for them. Walking outside on a bright sunshiny day is often just too much. It's more than a child can handle. For over responsive to vestibular and proprioceptive input, we often see these kids as our couch potato kids. They don't want to move. Any head movement, remember, activates your vestibular system, and then weight, when you stand up, weight on those muscles and joints activates your proprioceptive system. And because they're over responsive to that input, it's frightening to them, it's scary, and they just avoid it altogether. And then our interceptive. These kids may eat or drink constantly because those hunger pains are scary. They may also use the restroom frequently to avoid that feeling of their bladder being full. Now, the next type is sensory discrimination. Our ability to discriminate is just our ability to identify an object by one of our sensory systems. We can look at something and know what it is. Women, we often reach into our purse and, pull out a pen without looking. That's tactile discrimination. So, for tactile discrimination deficits, we often see poor speech articulation, and we see that because our tongue is a muscle, and when it has to move around in our mouth, and we have to know where to put our tongue to make certain sounds. And if you can't do that, it leads to poor speech. Children may also drool just simply because they don't feel it. And then they often have trouble holding on to things. They may drop things almost, it looks like on purpose, and it's just simply because they're not getting enough input to know to continue to hold on to it. Visual discrimination. One of the biggest things I see is the ability or inability to read emotions. So when a child gets the look from an adult, they may giggle instead of, being frightened like they should be because they're not able to distinguish a difference between a serious look and you being silly. They just can't distinguish those differences, and they don't know how to respond appropriately. Other discrimination, visual discrimination issues include difficulty recognizing letters and numbers and difficulty judging distances. For proprioceptive deficit, these are our toe walkers. These are also kids who tend to grind their teeth and chew on things. They tend to be viewed as clumsy. and they often use too much pressure when they play. So we're going to stop here. We'll talk about sensory-based motor on our next video. I hope this helped you understand more about sensory